This week we're jumping into spring with a lovely linen tunic type top. I'm very excited about this fabric. Look at this gorgeous linen. I ordered this from fabric.com and I've already pre-shrunk it. So I finished my raw edges, washed and dried it like it's going to be used for the rest of its wearable life, and it's lovely. I actually ordered swatches. They have quite a few nice linens. We pre-shrank them so we could see what they were going to look like once they were in use, and this is the one we picked, and it's glorious. I'm wearing my linen right here. So if you haven't sewn with linen, it sews lovely. It will always have a slightly soft, rumply look. That's just linen. You're paying for that look, that expensive, worn, rumpled look. It feels great, it wears great, it's a lovely natural fiber, very nice to sew with. The pattern is one that is currently not in stock. It's McCalls 2156. I'm doing this long tunic style with the long sleeve and the sort of Nehru collar, or it's a stand collar that doesn't have the fold over part. And that's what we're going to do. We are adding a little patch pocket to the front because our inspiration piece is very similar to this, and it has a little patch pocket on the front. So that's what we're going to do. And we bought, pardon the crinkly sounds, some lovely shell buttons. These are just regular shell buttons, but you can use either side. I bought a huge pack of them from Etsy because I'm doing 2 linen shirts for her, and this shell, the natural shell button I'm doing a white and a gray. You'll see the gray coming up. I'm going to do it also in a video for you on a different pattern. These are the findings. The only other thing you need is some good interfacing, and you need your matching thread. I am going to be doing part serging, part sewing because it has open, the tunic sides are pressed open. I can't do a flat felt seam or French seam, which was my original plan. But when I started looking at the pattern, it's pressed open. It has a split at the side. So I'm going to do a regular straight stitch with serged edges and press it open. I don't know if I probably will do a little top stitching here and there, and of course buttonholes and buttons. So I'm going to go ahead and press my pattern and cut it out. This pattern comes in one size in the envelope, so a medium or a small, that's how it comes. So if you go looking for this, and you can get them off of Etsy and eBay, there's lots of places where you can buy old patterns that are currently out of stock. Sometimes you can even get them from the pattern company. They'll have some out of stock patterns, or it'll be available to download in a digital pattern, so you may look for it that way. There are patterns sort of similar to it in the books right now, but this one was closest to the inspiration piece that we are copying. So I'm going to get going with cutting out. It's very straightforward. I don't think there's anything, just keep everything on the grain line. So I'll see you back in a little bit after I've cut out, and we'll move on to we'll press our interfacing next. So after we're cut out, we'll start putting in interfacing, and then we're sewing. I'm doing a few very minor alterations for the pattern. This is the sleeve, and it's quite long. So I've measured up what I need to. So I've taken out not quite 3 inches in the sleeve, and it has fold lines like this where you can do your adjustment. So I've taken out what I need to, and then you can see how it's uneven here, and you don't want to come along and cut and come in. That's not how we want it to work. We want to smooth out this edge. So you can do it lots of different ways. You can put another piece of paper behind it and draw in and even it out. But what I usually do is just fold up this little bit and make it nice and smooth. And then right here is the short sleeve option where you could cut off for the short sleeve, and we're just, again, going to fold in that little tab and make it smooth. And I'm going to do that on both edges so that we're ready to cut out our sleeve at the appropriate length. And for the length of the actual garment, it was 9 inches too long before hemming. So I've just turned up the 9 inches. I don't think I'll ever cut it the full length. This is probably as long as I'll ever cut it anyway. But I've just folded everything up and pinned it out of the way so it's there. If someday I want a floor length shirt, I guess I could make it. All right, I'm all cut out. I've interfaced my facings and my collar. You only interface one side of the collar. And now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my serger, and I'm going to serge the outer edge of the facing. Just finish off that. And then I'm ready to actually start putting the garment together. After I serge this, I'm going to go ahead and go to my garment pieces, and I'm going to serge not together but independently each piece on the shoulder seam and the side seams just to get them prepped, and then I'll be ready to put the garment together. So I'm going to sit at my serger for a few minutes and get all this prep work done, and then we're going to put this garment together. This is how it should look once you're through serging up. Here's the back, and you can see I've serged or finished off the edge. This is the shoulder seams, and here's the side seams. I did not do the armscye or the neck or the hem. I'm going to come back and get those later. But now that I've prepped this and I have my facings prepped, I can go ahead and put my front to my back, and I'm going to just straight stitch my shoulder seam and my side seam to the circle on the pattern. And this is adjustable because what it is, it's open on the side. So it's sort of up to you how far you want this. But there's two little circle options. I'm going to show you on the pattern. So here's one. So this is as much as the side seam is, and then this whole piece will be open. Here's the second one. So you can either have it short, where it's just sort of right below the waist, sort of the top of the hip, or you can go all the way down closer to the knee and not have it open till the knee. I'm going to kind of go between the two. It's going to be sort of mid-hip for me, just because of the person's height. If you go too low, it's just going to be hard to walk in this particular pattern because it's kind of straight. If you go too high, it's going to be flappy and floppy, depending on the fabric you chose. Now this fabric has a nice weight and will hang well, so I'm not as worried about that. But I'm going to go ahead and just go to the machine real quick, and I'm going to apply pattern front to my pattern back, and I just did a 3-thread serger stitch on mine, and I always sew it so that my serging stitch right side is with the right side of my fabric. Just makes life easy for me. Makes everything pretty when it's pressed open and finished. So here's my shoulder seam, and I've just laid the front on the back. So here's my front and my back, and I'm going to just stitch that, and then I'm going to come down and stitch the side seam to the circle, or to where I want it to stop. And I'm going to apply both fronts to my back, and I'm going to press those seams open, and then I'll be ready for sleeve, collar, facing. So, see you in a little bit. When pressing, I always start by just pressing it flat and making sure everything's nice and smooth. And that just helps embed the stitch down in the fabric a little bit, and it'll just give you a nice flat seam. Then you want to take this to the edge of your ironing board. Be careful here, we've got this neckline. I did not stay stitch it, but you can and maybe should, because you don't want to stretch it out. And then we're going to just gently, I'm going to finger press it first, and then I'm going to give it some steam and press that open. Now, depending on the fabric you're using for a project like this, you have to be careful, because sometimes this seam edge can kind of imprint through onto the outside of the fabric. So you want to be pretty careful how you press it. If possible, you actually want to press only on the seam itself. There's the seam pressed. Here's the seam not pressed. Can you see the difference? It's quite a difference. Look at how pretty and flat that lays. You want to make sure you press all of your seams next, and then we'll move on to the collar. On the side seam, when you press it, you're going to come into the part that's open. If you want to, you can go ahead and just keep pressing your 5/8 inch down, or just stop at the end of the seam and come back and worry about this when you're ready to hem, which is what I'm going to do. I'm only pressing this part of the seam because I want it nice and flat for when I'm ready to put my sleeve in. I'm going to do the hemming last, so I'm not going to even worry about this for a while. So far we have done this. So we've done the front and the back, which is step 1, and we have interfaced our facing, and we have finished off this edge. So now it's saying to go ahead and pin the facing to the front edge, and they actually show you sewing the neckline all the way down on this picture. But on this picture, they show it not sewn in the step above, but pressed up and then stay stitched. This is appropriate. Don't sew the neckline here. Only sew down the center front. Flip it around, because we're going to be putting a collar on. Yeah, because they show the collar going all the way to the outer edge, Now I'm doing the Nehru collar, or the stand without the fold over part of the collar, and it doesn't give directions for doing it that way, even though it does show an option with it. It only shows directions with you sewing it with the second collar piece, the flip over part of the collar in there. So this is what you want to do. This is the part with the interfacing. This is the part without the interfacing. We're going to pin these together, and we're going to pin up the non-interfaced piece the 5/8 of an inch up. So we're going to pin that up, and then we're just going to sew all the way around the collar with those two edges pinned up. And then we'll press up that 5/8 of an inch around. When sewing an interfaced piece to an uninterfaced piece, put the interfacing on top. The V-dogs underneath will help ease in the difference between the two. This piece is more stable and less likely to stretch. The piece that without interfacing is likely to stretch. So if we put it on the bottom, it helps keep everything copacetic. So we're ready to stitch. Here's our little collar piece, and you can see here's my seam allowance. This is the not interfaced side. This is the interfaced side. And now I'm going to come in on this curved edge, and I'm going to clip it and trim it out so that when I fold all of this in, all this bulkiness is not shoved up inside there. It'll make it nice and smooth. So the collar's ready to turn, and then I'm ready to sew my facings just down the front edge only. Okay, before I add the collar, this is the inside of my facing here where I've sewed it to the front. I have trimmed down one layer. I trimmed down the layer that has the interfacing on it, the facing layer, and left the other layer long so that when I turn it over, it just is a little less bulky, makes it smooth, it gives it a little gradation. It's called grading the seam. I'm going to press this, and then I want to go ahead and top stitch this down. I'm going to do some extra top stitching just because it looks nice and polished. It also makes everything lay right. This is where the buttons and buttonholes are going to end up going. So I'm going to do a little edge top stitch before I add the collar. Because I want to top stitch, that's going to come down into this hemline, and I want to go ahead and finish off the bottom of the hem so the top stitching can come down into that hemline and turn the corner and be nice and smooth and perfect. So I went ahead and I've serged off the edge of my hem, and this is ready to turn over to finish. But before I do that, I'm actually going to use my facing, and I'm going to measure up. This has 1.5 inch hem. You can make it deeper or narrower, but it's 1.5 inch is what's included. So I'm going to actually, because I resized at the bottom, I'm going to do 1 inch up for my project. So I'm going to sew 1 inch up just in this facing, and that's going to finish off this front edge for the hem. Okay, here's where I've stitched my 1 inch up. You can see where I've graded, and now I'm going to actually trim out this little bit of this corner for turning so that when this turns up like this, see how it folds up the rest of my hem for me, and then I can turn this to the right side and top stitch this down. Of course, I'm going to pull this out and make it nice and flat, but in order to do that, I need to trim out the excess in that corner. All right, here it is trimmed out so that when it turns, it looks like that. Okay, now I'm ready for top stitching. This is the collar pinned on, so this is the shirt side, and here's the collar side. And when you pin on the collar, you're pinning through the side of the collar. You're not pinning through both layers. You're pinning through only the layer of the collar that you did not turn up. This one where you turned up your seam allowance is free. That's going to cover all of this later. So now that this is gone from edge to edge, you can see here's my edge. They meet right at the 5/8 inch line. And I'm just going to stitch that all the way across at 5/8. Then we'll come back and grade and clip this neckline, and it'll be ready to flip over. And then I'm going to, you can either top stitch it down or whip stitch it down. Collar is on. This is from the inside. This is the outside. Doesn't that look pretty? And I've already pinned it down, but I'm actually not ready to sew it because I pinned it down for you so you could see it. But I need to come in and we need to grade this seam. See how thick that is? There's lots of layers. And so what we're going to do is this one that we're on the inside of the shirt. Here's the wrong side, the inside of the shirt. This one's going to get cut about 1/4 of an inch, And then if there's a third, there's an in-between one, that'll be a 1/2 inch. And then this one that's closest to the outside will leave at the 5/8 of an inch. See, we're just trying to get a gradual change, which is why it's called grading. So this will smooth that out on the inside and make it lay prettier. Just a quick little close-up of, if you're going to whip stitch this down, I'm taking my thread and picking up where I stitched it on. So this is the stitch that's holding the collar on, and I'm going through the little fold where I folded up my seam allowance, and I'm actually taking a stitch, and this is, you can do every other stitch or every single stitch, and I'm doing every single stitch, and you can see how tight and how they just disappear. Very, very pretty and easy to do. And we're just going to keep going through, and you can see they're so tiny. There's just hardly anything there. Okay, here's the inside of the collar, hand stitched. And here's what it looks like on the outside, completely invisible. So if you don't want any top stitching, stop here. If you want top stitching, you can add it now. I've got the collar done, and I moved on to the sleeve. For the sleeve, we need to finish our side seam edge. You can see I've serged that, but you don't want to do your sleeve cap. You could go ahead and serge your hem if you feel like it. That's up to you. Because my fabric looks identical, I cannot tell it right from wrong, left from right. I put a little pin on the right side so I don't end up with 2 left sleeves. And I have also very small, but there's little tiny marks where I have done my marking, so I can tell this is the back of my sleeve. There's 2 little cuts there, and I've gone ahead and done a little basting stitch into the sleeve cap so that I can, if there's any ease, I have a little stitch to do that with. Basting stitch is usually a size 4 or longer, a 4 or longer stitch length, and then no back stitching. So now that I've done all of those prep things, I can actually sew the sleeve together. So I'm putting right sides together. So my pin is going to be turned to the inside. This sleeve has a little extra, if I hold it straight, you can see a tiny bit hangs off. There's a little ease built into the back of the sleeve. And it actually, on the pattern, shows you doing a little basting line for your sleeve too at the elbow. It's minor enough, I'm not going to do that. I can actually just gently pull and make it fit. I don't have to run another basting stitch. But if you're finding with your fabric, linen is so forgiving. Linen, wool, silk, you're working with those, it's going to be pretty forgiving. You're probably not going to have an issue. If you're working with something that's really difficult, maybe a satin, a polyester satin, or a taffeta or something, or maybe it doesn't want to ease in as easily, you may have to run that basting stitch. But I'm just going to sew this seam together on both and press it open, and then I will go ahead and serge my hem after that, because I like to do the hem serging after I've made the seam. It's one of those things that I prefer to do. So I'm going to get those things set up, and then I'll show you about setting in that sleeve. I have put together my sleeve now, and I went ahead and hemmed it because it's really easy to put in an already hemmed sleeve than to hem the sleeve after it's attached to the shirt. It's a lot more unwieldy. So sleeves are together, and now I'm ready to pin them in. Okay, here's our shirt. And here's our nice little collar. And here's our shoulder seams. Real straightforward. Now, these are the things that you, as a sewist, get to decide. You are the designer. If you want to, you can top stitch over this seam. You can do decorative stitching. You can leave it completely plain, whatever you like. I did go ahead, before I even put the sleeve in, and I have tacked down my facing. So there's a little tack. I lift up my little seam allowances to each other and just tack it down real quick. So I've done that, so the facing will go nowhere. And now I'm ready to take my sleeve, and I'm going to find, this one has the single notch, so that's front. So I'm going to match right side sleeve to right side garment, and this one. So here's my underarm. I'm going to take underarm to underarm and put a pin, right sides together. All right, and then I have my notches, so we'll match up our notches, but there's no fitting in the underarm part, so this should fit nice and tight and well. Lovely. Put a few pins in it. You want to be careful when you're working with your necklines and your Armsceye and something like this. They can stretch, and you just want to be cautious so that you don't end up stretching out those curvy areas, your necks and your Armsceye. If you are dragging this around, trying it on and off lots of times, then I recommend basting those curvy spots before you do much of anything, just to keep the integrity of it. So now that I've done that, here's sleeve, here's shirt, and I'm going to get my shoulder marking to the shoulder and pin that, and then I can see how much excess I have, and I've got my little basting stitches so I can pull those in to pull in the fullness. And there should be no gathers, so we're pulling in the fullness, but we should not have any gathers. And then we'll stitch it in. So I'm going to finish pinning this. I'll show you once it's completely pinned so you can see how the gathers lay out. All right, here's the sleeve pinned in, so you can see I haven't pulled any of the fullness out yet with the basting stitch, but it fits in pretty close. You can see there's just a little tiny bit of extra ease in there, but it should go in pretty straightforward, especially in a natural fiber like this. And I've gone ahead, after your sleeve is in and it fits and you don't have any little fold overs or gathers or whatever, take the basting stitch out if it shows, and then here's the raw inside of the sleeve. And this one is finished. This one I've serged. Normally when you are finishing off a sleeve, you lose a little seam allowance. You don't finish it off at the 5/8 inch because that 5/8 inch will be sticking up into your arm. So normally you will trim it back to maybe more like 3/8 of an inch. So you can see it's a little narrower on this, but it's trimmed off. So I'm going to do that on the other one. And then I'm ready to hem, buttonhole, and button. So I'm going to finish my other sleeve, and I've already started the hemming. So I'm going to show you because you're going to see hems next. So here's where I did my top stitching on my facing, and you can see that it automatically folds up this part of the hem. So this hem is already folded up, and I've just done a few stitches in the 1 inch area here. I'm going to press everything, and then where this meets in the corner, I prefer to have it fold so that the little folded area is at the bottom of the hem and not the side of the hem. I just think it's more attractive and be less likely to be seen. You also can do things where you fold it just right and do like a little mitered corner in that area. So when I'm ready to do that, I'll show you how to do a little mitered corner right there. Okay, I'm going to put it in the other sleeve, and then I'll meet you over at the ironing board. So I pressed up my hem so that I had good markings with the iron, and then I drew across it faintly with pencil. See that line right there? So if I match this up, the pencil to pencil, and so that, let me pin it so you can see. All right, so I just pinned on that line, and you can see how it makes a mitered corner. Now, I have got two different hem widths here. This one's 1 inch, and this one's 5/8 of an inch. So they're not going to meet perfectly right here. It's going to be a little bit off, which is understandable. But that sure makes for a pretty corner. So you can definitely do miters if you prefer, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go through and miter every corner first. I'm going to just press everything up and miter all these corners, and then I will come back and top stitch. All right, I'm doing my hemming and my top stitching, and I'm coming to where the front and back are joined together and where I have to make a decision about how I want to come across this seam. So I can come right up in line with this and then stitch straight across and come down, or I can come up and go at an angle to sort of make an arrow shape at the top, and I'm going to do the little arrow. If you have a hard time with keeping things straight, you can draw your arrow on with some tailor's chalk or something that'll come off. All right, so I'm coming across at the angle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Sink my needle, and now I'm going to turn, and I'm going to do the same angle and count 8 stitches down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Sink. I'm ready to rotate and stitch down. Yay! All right, now that I've stitched down, you can kind of see the little arrow area. All right, we have a shirt It's hemmed, it has a collar, the sleeves are in. All that's left are the buttons and the buttonholes. So I'm going to now start marking out buttons and buttonholes. This is my front pattern piece. Everything else has been put away, and it's on here for us. Nice and easy. It shows where our center front is. It shows our spacing for our buttonholes, and it goes way down. Look at that. So I'm just going to use these markings. My buttonhole length is going to be about 1/8 of an inch longer than my actual button. I have pretty thin buttons because they are made from real shells, so they're not super thick. But normally if you make your buttonhole length, the diameter, whatever your button is around, so if you get like a 5/8 inch button, that's how wide your button is. And then you add to it how deep your button is. So usually it's around 1/8 of an inch, 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch, and that's how big you should have a buttonhole be. Otherwise your buttonhole's not going to go through, or your button's not going to go through the buttonhole well. So I'm just going to mark my buttonholes and buttons. Typically, clothing manufacturing, women's clothing is the right comes over the left, and men's is the left comes over the right for shirts and pants and that sort of thing. It's really up to you. You can do whatever you choose, but I am going to do this one just right over left. If you've been wearing mostly clothing from the women's department your whole life, you're kind of used to getting dressed that way. And if you've been wearing clothing mainly from the men's, you might be more comfortable with how it's just more of a habit than anything. It's an old-fashioned construct, but you can do what you please with it. It's your garment. I am going to go ahead and put buttonholes in the right side, and then the buttons will go on the left. And I'll show you, I'm going to go ahead and make a buttonhole. I'm not teaching you how to do buttonholes really, because for me it's machine dependent. I just set my machine up and it handles it for me. So it's really just marking your measurements and going. You want to make sure that your buttonhole starts about 1/8 of an inch over from the center front of the shirt. So I'm going to just hold this up. So here's our seam allowance. So that's gone now because it's sewn in. So here's the front of our garment. And you see here's our buttonhole right here. See where it shows it starts right there? If you think about how big your button is, if my button is sewn on and it pulls to the front, you don't want your button to hang over this edge. So you want to make sure, you want to be careful about your spacing so that the button, like if you chose really big buttons and you started your buttonhole all the way over here, when that button is centered, it's going to hang over the edge. So you kind of want to think about that also. It never looks good for the button to cross the edge of your fabric as a rule. It just shouldn't happen. Could be a design detail on something that you're working on, but as a rule in traditional garment construction, your button should always stay within the placket and not come off of it. So I'm going to do buttonholes, and I'll sew on some buttons, and we'll have a finished garment, and I'll show you what it looks like. All finished. Forgot to mention that I was adding a front pocket. My sister really wanted pockets on it, so now they have pockets. Look at how pretty these buttons are. It's very pretty buttoned up. The buttons go almost to the bottom. I have a feeling it's probably going to be more like a jacket, open, maybe only with 1 or 2 buttons buttoned. But look at how pretty it is. It turned out great. I'm really pleased with it. It's really simple. It's great for a little over jacket for springtime. Did the whole project in one day from pattern prep to finish. It's about 5 o'clock. So you can see I got this done in time for me to go upstairs and actually make supper if I wanted to. Not going to be the best lighting, but I'm going to do a few close-ups just so you can see. There's the buttonholes and the buttons. There we go. Here's the sleeve. I rolled up the sleeve. It's a very plain sleeve. Here's the other side. Pocket. I did the little arrow tops on the pocket. Sort of an arrow at the side slits. Here's our collar. I decided not to do any top stitching on the collar, so here it is whip stitched down on the inside. Anyway, that's the basics of it. It turned out really pretty, and I'm excited to get it to my sister.